Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Reformed GGA, and I am going to be talking about church response teams, for lack of a better phraseology. It's not something that on this video channel I've talked about all that much. Most of my videos on this channel have more or less been product reviews, reviews of braces, reviews of different kinds of guns, things like that, comparison between different kinds of gun. Mostly product reviews, but this is an issue that hits kind of close to home for me because I'm a Reformed Christian. That's what the Reformed and Reformed GGA refers to. And as a Reformed Christian, that means that I go to church. Reformed Christians, like all biblical Christians, believe that there is a mandate in the Bible to assemble with the people of God to regularly attend church. It is a command. It's not an option. It's a command for us. And so that is what we do. Generally, at least once a week, provided we have it available to us, we meet together with God's people to worship the one true and living God. And unfortunately, in this modern age, as has happened in the past as well, but in this modern age, it tends to make us targets. And there's lots of people that don't like Christians, as well as there are people who don't like lots of other groups as well. But the most persecuted religious group in the world right now is Christians. More Christians die by martyrdom in the modern age than any other religious group. We definitely have the odds stacked against us. And here, even in America, where we have a great many freedoms and a great many protections, there are still people who seek to do evil to us, as well as there would be people who would seek to do evil to other religious groups. And no, I'm not saying that those other religious groups are as legitimate, not at all. I'm a Reformed biblical Christian, and that means I only believe that there is one true living God, and there is only one way to have peace with that one true living God, and that is through Jesus Christ. Nothing else. So I'm not saying that those others are legitimate, but I'm saying that the one true living God's standards of righteousness and justice apply to everyone. We are obligated to treat other people, even people who do not necessarily agree with us, justly. And we are to be concerned with people who, relative to a given situation, are innocent. Reformed Christians don't believe that people are innately innocent. We believe that we are all sinners by nature. But we believe that relative to a given situation, people can be situationally innocent. That is, in a particular situation, they weren't the ones that did the wrong thing. And when a person is situationally innocent, it is our duty as people who teach the commands of God and who uphold the justice of God to seek that justice would be done for them. So a lot of what I'm going to say, even though it is motivated by the fact that I'm a Reformed Christian operating out of the principle of attending a Reformed Christian church service, a lot of what I say is going to be applicable to other groups that would have similar concerns. And if they choose to use this kind of material justly and righteously, I don't have any complaints. That does not mean that I consider them to be legitimate for 1 second, but it means that the standards of God's justice apply equally to all mankind. God's justice is God's justice regardless of the person under investigation. And there are a lot of people that don't like that fact, but it's true. Okay, like I said, does not mean for a second that I think that those other religions are legitimate, but it does mean that they are, that the standards of justice do not change just because a person happens to be wrong in a different area. Okay. So, without further ado, let's get into the issue that I wanted to talk about. And the issue that I wanted to talk about is the applicability of long guns to church shootings. And to help illustrate my point here, I'm going to play a couple of videos. And I'm going to play them without sound because, unfortunately, on the system that I have available to me right here, whenever I play sound from a video file, it tends to echo. just the way that the system picks up the sound. It's not an overly complicated system. It's basically just my laptop with a special program on it that records what's going on the screen. And technically it records the audio as well, but it double records the audio, and I have not been able to find a way to not get it to do that. So given the limitations of what I have to work with, the best option is to play it without sound. And the first video that we're going to look at comes out of Florida, and this is a fairly recent event that happened within the past few months. And the basic situation goes like this. There were a couple of jewelry thieves who performed a jewelry heist, and in the process of getting away from the heist, they basically commandeered a UPS truck with the UPS driver inside, held him hostage, told him to drive, assumably at gunpoint, and led the police on a merry chase. And what we're going to see is the end of that chase. And this video is going to show graphic content, and so I would suggest that if you are a person of such a demeanor that you do not want to watch this, or there are small children present, etc., etc., this would be a good time for all those people in that category to leave the room perhaps, or maybe to fast forward to another part of the video where you don't see this video on the screen anymore. All those kinds of things. It is going to be graphic, and it is going to show instances in which people die. Alright, let's go ahead and start the video here. Okay, what this shows is the police coming up on this vehicle, and they're shooting. And you'll see that most of the police start off in excess of 15 yards away from the vehicle. That's going to be an important number later on. They're shooting at the vehicle. You'll notice that a lot of the shots are not connecting with anyone in particular. They're hitting random places in the vehicle. Not particularly well aimed at all. The police wind up using the civilians' vehicles, the civilian SUVs here, as their cover position, which is morally gross and negligent, that you're involving people who are situationally innocent in a gunfight and using them as human shields. Not good, but that's what happens. And in the process of this shootout, they wind up shooting the two thieves. The UPS driver who was taken hostage also dies, and then one of the innocent bystanders in one of the vehicles that was there, I'm not sure exactly which vehicle it was, but one of the bystanders in the nearby vehicles also wound up losing their lives in this shootout. And the basic reason for this is the kinds of weapons that were being used and the engagement distance that these were happening at. Like I said, the initial engagement took place beyond 15 yards. Of course, eventually the police wound up moving in closer than that, but the initial engagement occurred at beyond 15 yards. The vast majority of the shots were misses, to include hitting people that should not have been hit, people who were situationally innocent. Now, in the context of law enforcement, the Supreme Court has ruled, I think multiple times now, that law enforcement has no duty to protect situationally innocent civilians, which I think is absolutely appalling in every sense of the word. But that is the legal situation that we deal with here in America. Our police are not required to protect us at all. What they are required to do is to try to apprehend suspects. They have a duty to pursue and apprehend. They do not have a duty, according to the Supreme Court, to protect. And that is why you see police officers who are ducking behind civilian vehicles and things like that. The protection of the people that are involved, they are not overly concerned about. Their concern is getting the bad guys. Their concern is pursuing and apprehending suspects. That is their legal obligation. Any means that they can use to do that is sufficient for them. But, like I said, there's a lot of missed shots, and two people who were situationally innocent, not in the cosmic sense. Like I said, as a Reformed Christian, we believe that all people are sinners by nature, and so we don't view people as being innocent by default. Instead, we believe that in a given situation, there are people who can be at fault and people who cannot, relative to that situation, be at fault. And that's how we judge things relative to temporal earthly justice, if you will. And the fact of the matter is that from a Reformed Christian perspective, 2 people died in this situation that should not have. The UPS driver who was taken hostage, and one of the civilian drivers of one of these surrounding vehicles also died. And from a Reformed Christian point of view, that is not only not good, it is lamentably evil and terrible, and definitely not what we would want to see happen. Okay. Like I said, from the law enforcement point of view, technically they don't have an obligation to protect, according to the Supreme Court. But for us as Reformed Christians, if we're going to be dealing with something that happens inside of our church, someone comes in to shoot up the place, the reality of the fact that beyond 15 yards, people who are using handguns, and that's the primary weapon system that was at play here, almost everybody was using a handgun of some sort. Officer over here with a handgun, handgun. Pretty much everybody was using handguns. And at those distances, under stress, with people firing back at you with your own life on the line, your odds of being accurate go down, way down. And remember, these are people who have to qualify in their shooting, usually at least once a year, sometimes more, but usually at least once a year they have to demonstrate firearms proficiency, whereas the average civilian does not. And talking about church safety, a lot of churches will have either a formal or an informal response team of some sort or another. Sometimes a formal team that's put together with the understanding that if something happens, you're the ones who are going to respond, or it's just an informal thing. We know that some of you guys like to conceal carry, and we'd appreciate it if you conceal carry in church and, do what you got to do if the need should arise. But the fact of the matter is that these are trained professionals who have to shoot to qualification at least once a year, and beyond 15 yards, they are abysmal shots. So much so that 2 people who were situationally innocent wound up dying. And like I said, from a Reformed Christian perspective, that's not what we want. It's bad enough when we have to kill in self-defense. Okay, we don't consider that to be murder. Killing in self-defense is a different legal category in the law of God, but we still lament the loss of human life. We will try to avoid it if possible, but we always lament the loss of human life, even if it is something that is considered just by God's standard, by biblical standards. But the loss of people who are situationally innocent is absolutely terrible. And that's exactly what happened in this situation in Florida with this UPS hostage situation. And like I said, it has everything to do with the engagement distance and the kinds of guns that were being used. Handguns beyond 15 yards, typically extremely ineffective with regard to actually shooting what you intend to shoot. Now, from their point of view, it was effective in that they managed to get the suspects. The suspects also died. And like I said, legally their duty is to pursue and apprehend suspects. And they accomplished that goal. But for Reformed Christians, we also have a duty to, as much as possible, preserve situationally innocent human life. And we also have a duty to preserve even guilty human life as much as possible. Yes, it is allowable, biblically speaking, to engage in self-defense, to kill in self-defense, but it is never preferable for us. What we would prefer happen is that people be taken without lethal force and that they would actually stand trial. What we like to see is the culture upholding the law of God and bringing justice to bear so that the culture itself is saying, no, what you did is evil and wrong and wicked, and they would pass down appropriate punishments on these people. We don't want to see these people die like this if it's avoidable. Like I said, it is an allowable category, but it is not a preferable category for us. Hey, what happened here for us is a tragedy, especially because of the loss of life in general, and more particularly, the loss of life of people who are situationally innocent. Okay, so that is my first point, is that even people who are considered professionals who have to meet qualification with handguns, when it comes to a real-world scenario with real-world stress, Beyond 15 yards, they're usually pretty much useless, and there's a really high probability that you're going to hit someone that you don't want to. And in the context of the church, the actual church service, someone that you are going to very probably wind up hitting that you didn't want to hit is very likely to be someone who's situationally innocent, another member of the congregation, a potential family member, potential spouse, maybe someone there had given birth to, quite possibly. You usually have families there and families with small kids, etc. It's going to be a messy situation, and the last thing that you want on your conscience is to have to kill anybody, but especially the death of someone who is situationally innocent. Okay. So, first main point, even professionals with handguns will very much so miss beyond 15 yards. Second video that I wanted to bring up is one that has become fairly famous now, and that is the live stream that came out of a Texas church in which there was an active shooter. And it's become fairly famous because the active shooter was shot by a member of the church. And so the situation was resolved relatively quickly, and that man, Mr. Wilson by name, was given special accommodation by the governor of Texas. It's been in a lot of news stories. I'm sure a lot of people have heard about it, and if you haven't, just simply, Google Wilson and church shooting, and I'm sure that'll come up. It's become fairly famous, but there are a couple of things about it that I wanted to point out. Now, just to kind of set the stage here for what's happening, and most of the action is going to take place in this upper left-hand corner of the video. I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. The video camera was not directly on the person for the live stream, and so things kind of took place out of frame, but everything's going to happen in this upper corner. What's going to happen is that the church shooter is going to come out from the pews, and he's going to go and talk to this usher over here and become very irate with the usher, pull a shotgun on him that he had hidden in his clothing. And while he's engaging with this usher, this man who is sitting right here is going to respond to it by trying to draw his own weapon. He's going to fail to draw his own weapon. He's going to wind up getting shot. And then this usher is going to get shot. And then the shooter is going to take off towards the front of the sanctuary, at which time Mr. Wilson back here is going to fire the shot that is going to end this encounter. So let's go ahead and watch this all take place. And I want you especially to take note of how quickly this all goes down. From the time that the gun is presented to the time that the situation is ended, it is very quick. It's like 6 seconds or something like that. Okay, so the perp is going back, confronting the usher, obviously not happy, pulls a gun. The one guard here tries to get out his gun, fails, shots go off, Mr. Wilson takes care of it. I would like to point out that from the point that Mr. Wilson shot him, which was back here, to where the man was standing at the time, the church shooter at the time was standing, that was about 15-ish yards, maybe just a little bit in excess of that. That is a shot that most people could not handle. Mr. Wilson is an exception to that. He is someone who actually is a firearms instructor, and he is the one who trains his church safety team. He is not your typical average day shooter. Okay, the fact that he got off that shot is a very, very, very lucky thing. Okay. But you will notice that the people who were nearby who tried to resolve the situation, the one man who was, let me see if I can back this up just a little bit. Okay, so the one man that was sitting down here who tried to intervene, he wasn't able to resolve the situation, and the usher wasn't able to resolve the situation. The usher was such that he basically had the shotgun on him immediately. That's where the shooter's attention was focused at the time, and so he didn't really have a whole lot that he can do. If you try to draw a firearm when someone is pointing their gun at you, it's basically a really good way to get shot. And so he wasn't able to do a lot about it. This guy over here who did try to draw his weapon and get a shot off, he may have been able to do something about it, but unfortunately his draw took a long time. Let's go ahead and play that again and focus on this guy here who's seeing this all go down and tries to intervene. He sees that something's going on, gun comes out, he tries to draw from the small of his back, and he gets shot in the process. This is another potential issue with handguns. Depending on how they are carried, they can really slow down your reaction time. The three main places that I would like to talk about that really hinder your reaction time, in this case, was small of the back, carrying it directly behind you. You notice that the man stood up, and that's because that's how he had to do it in order to get access to his gun. He had to stand up to deal with it. And what that did is it telegraphed to the shooter that this guy over here is doing something. He's a potential threat. As soon as you move, you have to be able to engage. But he wasn't able to engage. He was still drawing his gun at that point. Most self-defense experts that are out there, like John Crea, and by the way, this video is on John Crea's YouTube channel. It's called Active Self-Protection, for those of you guys who are wondering. And self-defense experts like that will tell you that your draw needs to be 2 seconds or less. And that might sound like a long time, but under stress it really isn't. And there are certain positions, like I said, from like small of the back, that it can be really hard to get a quick enough draw to actually be meaningful, especially if you're going to be that close to the action. Another place that is not good to carry in terms of your speed into action is, of course, carrying in an ankle holster. If your primary gun that you're relying on is in an ankle holster, you're going to be very slow into the fights. Another bad place is usually some kind of a under-the-shoulder harness. Those can also be fairly slow, especially depending on how you have it carried. There are some people that I know that run a shoulder harness that actually have the harness under like a button-up shirt or something like that, and they're not getting that gun out anytime soon. Okay. For a church response team, either a formal one or an informal one, you don't want people carrying in such a way that it places them at a significant disadvantage. And that man died because of the fact that he had a slow draw stroke. He drew his gun too slowly. And that's why he died. And if you're going to have people in your church that are willing to defend others like this, and I'm thankful for his willingness to do that, the fellow died in the defense of his fellow church members. I'm certainly not knocking that at all. That is a good thing that he was willing to do that. But it would have been nice if someone had taken him aside and said, we see the way that you're carrying, we see your draw stroke, it's not fast enough. We really would suggest that you carry in a different way. Okay. Typically, strong side hip or even appendix carry. Appendix carry can be problematic for other reasons, but in terms of speed of draw, strong side hip and appendix carry tend to be the fastest. And for people who are working as some kind of a response team, either formally or informally, they need to carry like that, quite frankly. Because like I said, small of the back, ankle holsters, and a lot of times shoulder holsters can become very big problems in terms of being able to respond to the threat quickly enough. Okay, so that is an issue. Now, another thing that I want to point out here with this particular shooting is this lady right here. Now, fortunately, the screen is not big enough for you to actually see her very well, and I'm not trying to embarrass her in specifically, but look at the position of everyone else around relative to her. She's popped up a little bit. Everybody else is cowering and they're getting out of the way, but she has popped up. And if we play the rest of the video, and especially if we played it with sound, you're going to hear a woman screaming her lungs out, and it's this woman. She is not someone who is emotionally fit. Okay, she is reacting very strongly, very emotionally, not exercising very good judgment here. And in interviews, Mr. Wilson here, who's going to take the shot that ends the fight, he says that he had to wait to take his shot until the people down here got low enough that he could take it. this woman right here is who he was referring to. He didn't call her out by name. He wasn't trying to embarrass her or anything like that, of course. And I'm not trying to do that either. Okay, like I said, the picture is small for a reason, and I'm leaving it small for a reason. I'm not going to be zooming in on her or anything like that. And in a situation like this, it's hard to know how any of us are going to respond. But her actions slowed down the shot that ended the fight. It wound up proving to be a detriment to taking care of the situation. And if you play through the rest of the video, when people are responding to the situation, you'll notice that she winds up basically jumping up and down and running around screaming. And this is the time where people are getting the cops called, where people are checking on people who have been shot, both of whom died, both the guard and the usher died as a result of their wounds. And she's running around screaming like a banshee. Like I said, in that situation, yes, it's terrible, and no one's going to hold her criminally responsible or anything like that. But the fact of the matter is that she wasn't doing any good, and in fact, she was in the way. And this is something that does need to be talked about with your congregation. If something happens, and if you're not one of the people that are going to be responding to this lethal force with lethal force of your own, you need to get out of the way. Okay. She slowed down the reaction of Mr. Wilson. Not that he holds it against her or anything like that, but it's the reality of the situation. Okay, emotional fitness is a very important thing for Christians in this day and age. Like I said, we wear targets on our back. We are the religious group that dies the most often right now. You take religious martyrs across the world right now, the largest proportion thereof are people who identify themselves as Christian. Okay, we wear targets on our back, and there's a good chance that we're going to wind up in a bad situation, and you need to be emotionally fit, and you need to have good, clear thinking. And this woman did not demonstrate that. Okay, and like I said, it's a good thing for the church to talk about with their congregation. The fact that when something bad happens, if they're not the ones who are responsible for dealing with it, especially in the case of a shooting, they need to get out of the way. Hit the deck, whatever the case, don't get in the way. Okay, all right, so all that being aside, next thing I want to focus on, like I said, is that distance. Here's where Mr. Wilson was when he basically fired the shot. The perpetrator is going to be running along this wall here, and that's in excess of 15 yards. And in the case of our UPS driver shooting that we saw, anything in excess of 15 yards, even for trained professionals, the police officers who have to qualify at least once a year, that can be really difficult to do. But like I said, Mr. Wilson is not a typical person. He is someone who actually trains others. He is basically a firearms instructor. That's what he does. Not a typical shooter. If this had been the average person or even the average police officer, and this is not to denigrate police officers, yes, I do think that the Miami police that were involved in this particular situation, I think it was in Miami, there's another jurisdiction that it might have been in, but these particular Florida police officers, I do find their behavior of hiding behind civilian vehicles to be reprehensible. Okay, and I get that it's a difficult situation. When you're being shot at, the reaction is going to be to hide. I get that. But these are the people who are supposed to be trained to deal with this situation, and they didn't deal with it very well. But on the whole, there's a lot of police officers that I do not think would act that way, and would indeed very much so try to help the situation and to protect people. But the average police officer wouldn't have the skills to make that shot. The fact that this guy was different, he did not have typical skills, it was beyond typical skills, is what gave him the advantage. Okay. Like I said, 15 yards, usually impossible for someone with a handgun to get off that good of a shot, especially when you're dealing with an obstacle in the way. Okay. The emotional fitness of your congregation and giving them simple instructions that's, if somebody starts shooting in the sanctuary, get down. If you're not a part of the solution, please don't contribute to the problem. Okay, like I said, I'm not necessarily knocking her on that one, when weird, unexpected things happen, you're going to react, and it's very much so common that people are going to react emotionally. But if you're a part of a group that has a target on their back, you need to expect that bad things are going to happen, and you need to react in a cool, calm, and collected manner. She did not. Mr. Wilson did. And that made all the difference. Okay, so what is the solution here? We've seen that handgun shots beyond 15 yards are very difficult for professionals, and that they can be done, but by people who have a lot of training under their belt, and indeed are beyond even the typical professional level of training. This guy is not a typical firearms professional. He's a firearms instructor. Okay, this shot would have been very, very, very difficult for most users. Okay, for most typical handgun users. So what's the solution? The solution is the long gun. Now, preferably, you'd want these kinds of situations to be taken care of at as early a point as possible so that you don't get into these big spaces. Big spaces with lots of people are exactly what these kinds of people want. They want a target-rich environment, and they want it to be a relatively enclosed environment, and they also want it to be a fairly spacious environment. Why? Because it puts them at the advantage. Like I said, most people cannot make that kind of a distant shot. And so the only thing that the active shooter, has to worry about is the people that are immediately next to him. And so if he can take care of the people who are immediately next to him, like the one guard and the usher, he has the advantage, because most people, like I said, can't make a long shot with a handgun. So you do want to take care of this early before they get into the sanctuary, because once they get into the sanctuary, or in the case of the time where you're having like a potluck dinner or something like that, into the fellowship hall, as the case may be, wherever there's a large congregation of people in an enclosed space that's relatively spacious, where there's going to be fairly long shots that are going to be difficult for the average person to make, that's exactly what an active shooter wants. A place where it's harder to hit them, but it's easy for them to hit whoever is around them. That's what they want. And every effort needs to be made to stop them before they get into the sanctuary. And this is one case where, again, I have to fault this particular church. The behavior of this woman slowed down the reaction and just got in the way when people were dealing with the aftermath. Okay, it is the reality of the situation. Like I said, I'm not necessarily faulting her in so much as, you never know how you're going to react to a situation until you're in it. But it did hamper things. And the fact that they allowed this guy into the sanctuary was a major problem. And the reason why I'm being hard on them about this is because when you read the reports and you hear the interviews, it's really clear that this guy should not have gotten this far. He was someone that was known to the church as a troublemaker of sorts, and when he came to the church this day, he was dressed in unusual clothing that was not appropriate to the temperature of the environment. And one of the biggest giveaways is that he was wearing an obviously fake beard. When people walk into an environment in which they are known to have problems with people in the environment, they're angry at people in the environment, and they're dressing in a way so as to conceal who they are with an obviously fake beard and things like that, these are people that you probably should not let pass the front door. Okay, one of the best places to station people is at the front door, and you usually want to have multiple people there. Okay, a lot of people might be alive if they had stationed a couple people at the front door. They see this guy come in, give him verbal commands. They see that this is a very clear, obvious problem. This guy's wearing a fake beard, and on top of that, we know who this guy is. We know he's a troublemaker. Give him verbal commands. Say, you need to stop right here. We need to talk. If he doesn't respond to the verbal commands, you have a couple of people strong-arm him out. And the nice thing about that is if you intervene in an early period, first of all, you don't risk the lives of the rest of the congregation members. And on top of that, you can also usually successfully deal with the situation without the loss of the life of the suspect. If they had stopped him right as he walked in the front door, there's a very good chance that he would still be alive today. Okay? Like I said, issue verbal commands. If he doesn't respond, have a couple guys strong arm him out of there. Get them out of the building as quickly as possible. Call the police. Do whatever you need to do to resolve the situation. There's a good chance that it will be resolved without any bloodshed. Yes, charges will be filed appropriately, but there's a really good chance that the situation will be resolved without anybody dying. And from a Reformed Christian point of view, that's what's preferable. Yes, we are willing to kill in self-defense, but we'd really prefer not to. We would really prefer that the society itself uphold God's standards of justice. That's what we would like to see happen, that people who are guilty according to God's standards would be tried by the society, and society would uphold the appropriate standards, and people would receive justice that way. That's what we like to see. We like to see a society that upholds and submits to God's standards, and a society that is given that task. Okay, we like to see justice done. Okay, we are not vigilantes. That's not our thing. We want to see good, godly government. We're not anarchists. Now, there is an interesting philosophical debate and a very important religious debate that comes in when you're dealing with a society that is going to absolutely refuse to do the godly thing. But generally in situations like this, that isn't the case. Generally, the society will say that if this was an active church shooter who had clear intent, or at least you had probable cause to be suspicious of this person, society as it is now is generally going to support you in that regard. And if society will support you in that regard, in being godly, that's what we would prefer to have happen. We don't want to see people die if they don't need to, and we do want to see society as a whole condemn this person. We want to see good, godly government at work. Okay, we're not anarchists, we're not against government, we just want godly government. Okay. And like I said, if they had stopped this guy at the front door, this probably never would have happened. Okay, so as far as solutions for dealing with this issue is, first of all, don't let them get into the big rooms with lots of people in them. Okay, having a couple of guys stationed at the front door is a really good idea. And then once they get into the big rooms with lots of people, you're going to want a way to deal with them that is going to be better than dealing with them with a handgun. Because like I said, handguns at great distances, there's a good chance that you're going to miss and you're going to hit someone who's innocent. We saw that in the case of the UPS driver that was taken hostage. Both he and one of the bystanders wound up dying in the shootout. Not good. And in this case, there were still a couple of people that died, and like I said, if we had intervened at the front door instead of waiting for them to get into the sanctuary, we could have stopped it right there. But the only reason why this case wound up being as good as it was is because you had a highly trained and skilled marksman who could make the handgun work for him beyond 15 yards. Most people can't do that. So the solution is that if a threat does get into the sanctuary, you need a gun system that can take care of threats at longer distances. And this is where some churches have a very distinct advantage. They will have a position in the sanctuary that is somewhat removed from the people. It's not easily accessible to the people in the congregation, but it's a position from which the person there can see everyone in the congregation. And that is a lot of times people who are in a sound booth. In a lot of sanctuaries, there will be some kind of an elevated sound booth somewhere in the back. And a lot of times the people who are in that elevated sound booth will be able to gain access visually to the entire sanctuary. They'll be able to see everything that's going on. And it is a really good idea to give someone who's in that kind of position a long gun. One of the quintessential long guns would, of course, be something like an AR-15. It is a powerful gun. It is accurate. It can be used at distance. I would strongly suggest that you use it with a red dot. It is much easier to acquire a target quickly with a red dot than it is with pretty much any other sighting system that are out there, especially at intermediate distances that would occur within buildings. You don't need something that's going to reach out to 1,000 yards inside of your church, but you do need something that is going to be able to quickly and accurately take care of a target at whatever your greatest distance inside that building is. Okay. And a gun like an AR-15 is a good way to do that. It's something that you can have staged up in the sound booth, ready to go in case nobody else needs to know that it's up there. Okay, just the person who's responsible for it. And if a threat does get into the sanctuary, like I said, try to stop the threat as early as you can and with as little force as necessary. Okay, strong-arming someone out, issuing verbal commands, and if they don't respond to that, strong-arming them out of the building is a lot of times a lot better than waiting for them to get into the big room with lots of people. Because once they get into the big room with lots of people, that's exactly where they want to be, and it's not going to end well. Okay, don't do that. But if they do happen to get past you, okay, in the case of the church shooting in Texas, which Mr. Wilson responded to, the fact that this guy was bad news was pretty obvious. Like I said, he was dressed differently from everybody else. He was known as a troublemaker, and he was wearing a very obviously fake beard. There are a lot of church shooters, though, and active shooters that are not going to telegraph their intentions like that. Okay, the reason why I'm being so hard on these particular folks is because all the signs were there, and they didn't stop them when they should have, and that was at the front door, as soon as possible. Okay, but in a lot of cases, a lot of those signs are not going to be there. And there's a good possibility that the threat will get into the sanctuary. And when that happens, you want someone who has the right equipment to deal with a threat at longer distances. Because like I said, handguns beyond 15 yards in most people's hands are useless. Even the highly trained professionals are going to wind up missing a lot more often than not. And when you do see cases where people are able to get off successful shots at 15 yards or more, it's because they themselves are trained well beyond what either the average civilian is or even the average professional is. Like I said, this guy is not a professional. He's a firearms instructor. He has spent a lot more time with his gun and shooting it under different conditions than the vast majority of people ever will in their entire lifetime. He is the exception, not the rule. So to give yourself a chance, a fighting chance, have someone in the sanctuary who has access to a long gun. In the cases of churches that have elevated sound boosts, that's a really good place to put one. It's a spot that is visible, not that's necessarily visible, but a spot where you can see everything that's going on in the sanctuary and have a tool there that can operate at the necessary distances to deal with the threat. Now, there is a caution that I would give here about having an AR stationed in your sound booth. Of course, it should go without saying that this should only be for people that you trust. Okay, if your sound booth is run by a 12-year-old, because that's the only one who would run the sound booth that you could find to do it, probably don't want them to do this. Not that there aren't 12-year-olds that I think could run the gun. There are a lot of 12-year-olds that could successfully run an AR-15. An AR-15 is not an overly difficult gun to use. But putting the moral responsibility of having to save life by ending someone else's life is not something I'd want to put on a 12-year-old. Okay, so make sure that the task is appropriate to the person. But on top of that, again, going back to that reform principle of trying to preserve human life as much as possible, if you deal with a threat with a rifle that shoots a rifle caliber, you are greatly increasing the chances that in the process of incapacitating this bad person, you're going to kill them. So for moral reasons, churches may choose to use a less lethal sort of gun. And in those cases, where the church decides, yes, we want to be able to deal with a threat, and we see the advantage of using a long gun so that you can get those more distant shots more accurately with less collateral damage, we see that as being a good thing, but we're not sure that we want to use this much force. We want there to be a greater likelihood that the perp is going to survive so that they can actually face the court. Using a less lethal firearm, they're still going to have the potential to be lethal. Any firearm is like that. Even a little .22 can still be lethal. But comparatively less lethal, you might decide to go for a pistol caliber carbine. A very good one that is out there that is very reliable would be the CZ Scorpion. I'm very familiar with the platform. I happen to own one of them. I actually own a couple of CZ Scorpions and multiple CZ products. They're good guns. Very capable gun. It can hit targets out to 100 yards and very, very effective within 50 yards. It is a solid platform, very reliable, get done what you need to do. And the nice thing about it, since it fires at pistol caliber, it's a 9mm gun, the success rate of incapacitation is not significantly lower than with a rifle. It is lower, but it's not significantly lower. With 9mm cartridges, your probability of incapacitation is around 97%. Whereas with an actual rifle caliber gun, your probability of incapacitation is about 91%, so 87 to 91, not a huge difference there. But the chance of the person surviving their incapacitation is much higher with a pistol caliber gun. It is usually somewhere in the 50% range, that if you've incapacitated someone with a gun like this, a 9mm carbine, or just a 9mm in general, that they're going to survive. And 50-50 isn't great odds, but it sure beats what you get with an actual rifle caliber gun. If you shoot someone with an AR such that you've incapacitated them, there's like an 80% chance that you've killed them. And that's not the goal. The goal in a church response team is to stop the threat. It's not to kill. And like I said, as Reformed Christians, our goal is not to kill. Our goal is to preserve life as much as possible. And that even includes the life of the person who would seek to do us harm. We will respond with lethal force if necessary, but that's not the preferred alternative. So on a moral level, people may not opt for the AR just because the chances that you're going to kill them in the process of incapacitation is really high. Like I said, about 80%. Whereas if you drop down to a pistol caliber round, you can still fire it out of a rifle so that you can get the distance that you need. And that's the real advantage of a long gun, is that it gives you better accuracy at distance. You still get the accuracy that you need, but a lot lower lethality. Okay, yes, you do diminish your chances of dealing with the threat a little bit, but you greatly increase the chance that this person that you're dealing with is going to wind up having to stand trial for what they did. And from a Reformed Christian point of view, that's a good thing. Okay, another gun that is out there that works well for this is the Kel-Tec Sub 2000. The Kel-Tec Sub 2000 can be a little ammo picky. Generally speaking, stay away from aluminum case ammo and steel case ammo, but other than that, it's usually actually pretty reliable, at least in 9mm. Don't go for the 40. 40 is not great. But in 9mm, as long as you stay away from aluminum case ammo and steel case ammo, the Sub 2000 is usually a very reliable gun. You can mount an optic on it. Some kind of a red dot is what I would suggest. And one of the great things about it is that it's a gun that folds. You can see that in this picture here. It folds in half, and when it folds in half, it's less than 17 inches long. It's very easy to throw in a backpack, take wherever you need to take it, then, of course, unfold it, stage it where you need to stage it. Very portable gun, and a lot of times when it's stowed away in a backpack, people don't know that it's there. Okay, an AR-15, when you go to stow it and carry it in and out of the church, it's going to be kind of obvious, because there's a certain shape there, and it's usually a fairly long shape, and if anybody sees it, they're going to know what's going in and coming out, and it can draw a lot of suspicion and questions that you don't necessarily want to have. The reason why people are going to church is to worship the one true and only living God. That is not so that they can be thinking about guns in any way, shape, or form. That's not what the emphasis should be. The emphasis should be on God. And so if you're carrying around something in a way that distracts from that, that's not optimal at all. And it's going to wind up disturbing the church service on one level or another. And so most church response teams, either formal or informal, prefer to keep the fact that they have these things around kind of on the down low. And carrying in a big old gun case to hold your big old gun, not great. The CZ Scorpion does have a folding stock, and so you can fit in a little bit smaller case. But if you're doing the carbine version, even with the folded stock, it's kind of long. It's like 26 inches, even folded up. Not super small. All right, the Kel-Tec Sub 2000, on the other hand, though, it folds down to about 17 inches overall. That's real small. Like I said, you can throw it in a backpack. Nobody has to know that it's there. And, the person who's responsible for it, sitting up there in the sound booth or whatever, they just walk in with a backpack on. They do whatever they do up there. They keep the gun low and out of sight. It can be sitting at the desk next to them, just ready if they need it. Most of the time they aren't going to need it, fortunately, but it's there if they do. And then when it's time to pack up, you just take down the gun, hold it, put it back in the backpack, and you walk out with a backpack, and that's all that people see. Very preferable in that regard. And because it is a 9mm, the chances of the person that you shoot surviving is significantly higher. Okay, and that's one of the things that needs to be weighed, though. The responsibility of preserving the life of people in the sanctuary versus preserving the life of the perpetrator is something that needs to be balanced out. And then also, like I said, maybe carrying it in and out in a not so obvious manner can sometimes be a good deal. And having a gun that is conducive to that can be a good deal. And now there is another reason why people might not want to use an AR-15 for church defense purposes. And that is because once this happens, there are going to be news stories. And how the news presents what happens can very well depend on your choice of firearm. And with an AR-15, the news headline could very well read that church member shoots protester with assault rifle. Now, that would be a great exaggeration and, in fact, an outright lie, but unfortunately, that's kind of the way that media in America works. Media in America is not overly fond of Christians, and they're definitely not fond of AR-15s, and so there's a real good chance that someone is going to spin it in the most negative way possible. And if you give them the opportunity to talk about an AR-15, there's a real good chance that they're going to talk about it in as negative a fashion as possible. So, when people are dealing with that issue, they say, okay, we're okay with using a rifle caliber rifle, a true rifle, for this job. We consider, the greater likelihood of dealing with the threat so that you can preserve the life of other innocents, well, not other innocents, but the innocents that are in the room, because obviously the person who's perpetrating this is not situationally innocent at all. They're the one who's perpetrating it. But we want to be able to take care of it as effectively and quickly as possible, and we feel that a true rifle caliber is best at that. In those cases, picking a gun that doesn't look quite so scary can work to your favor when it comes time for the media reports. In those cases, I would suggest something like maybe a Mini 14. The Mini 14 that is pictured here has a nice wooden stock, looks very similar to a hunting rifle. It does have high-capacity magazines that can be bought for it, and so you're not really losing any significant firepower with it. The round that it shoots is, for all intents and purposes, identical to what you would shoot out of a typical AR-15. Technically, a lot of AR-15s shoot 5.56 NATO, while as the Mini 14 technically shoots 2.23 Remington. But the two cartridges are pretty much exactly the same, and at the given distances and under the given conditions, they're going to be pretty much the same. The only difference, though, is that this does not look nearly as scary, especially if you take the magazine out. And when it comes time for the media report, it's not going to receive quite the same attention. For people that are in this category where they're kind of concerned about how things might be spun by the media, but they still want to be able to respond to the threats, and they decide that they don't want to use an actual rifle caliber, they want to lower it a little bit to increase the chances that the threat will actually still be alive and face justice at the end, they might go for something like a CZ512. It's a semi-auto. The magazines that are available for it are either 5 or 10 rounders, which is not huge, but it's usually enough to get the job done. You can mount optics to it. It has a good reputation for being reliable, and it shoots .22 Magnum, which is not an overly powerful round. Tends to perform pretty similarly to 9mm, and so it'd be comparable to using a CZ Scorpion or a Kel-Tec because you want to increase the likelihood that the person that you're incapacitating will survive. It'd be used for basically the same reason. But the advantage of it is that it has a nice wood stock and a nice wood forend. It doesn't look as scary. So, diminished chance of killing the threat while still being able to incapacitate them, and it's not as likely to garner the kind of media attention that the media would be looking for as someone who would use an AR-15. Now, Another issue that comes up is that a lot of churches do not have sound booths that are nice and elevated where they can see the entire sanctuary. In a lot of churches, there will still be some kind of a sound booth, but sometimes it's positioned very awkwardly. A lot of times you'll have churches that everything is out on the same level. The sound booth is not elevated. It's at the same level as everything else. And it will be such that people who are walking into the sanctuary will actually be at the back of the person who's sitting in the sound booth. The sound booth will be a little bit forward. And in those cases, it's not usually a great idea to arm the guy in the sound booth. If he's at the same level as everybody else, there's a real good chance that people are going to be able to look over into the sound booth and see what's there. And if there's a rifle sitting there, they're going to go, oh, I know what that is. And at best, it winds up distracting from the worship service. At worst, it is going to make the person who's sitting at the sound booth a target for the would-be church shooter, because he knows that this person has a weapon and that's someone who needs to be taken care of immediately. Not an optimal thing. So if the sound booth is such that people entering the sanctuary are behind the person in the sound booth, and even just enough to be able to walk over to it and look inside the booth and see that there's a gun sitting there, not a good idea to give the long gun to the person in the sound booth. And in those cases, still having a long gun in the sanctuary is still a good idea, because those long shots from one part of the sanctuary to the next is very hard to do with a handgun. Still want to have that capability, but at that point, if the sound booth is at the same level as everybody else, it's really not a great place to be stowing a long gun. Instead, in those cases, it's better to focus on something that's a little bit smaller, that can be put in a backpack and quickly deployed. Something that you give to basically a random person in the sanctuary, at least from an outsider's point of view. It would be a random person in the sanctuary that happens to have a backpack down at their feet, that happens to have a more appropriate tool in it, we'll say. One such tool that I would suggest looking at is the pistol version of the CZ Scorpion. Yes, legally speaking, this thing that's pictured here is technically a pistol, because American laws are weird. But this is something that is relatively compact, and the nice thing about it is that it's relatively quick to deploy. I'm specifically picturing it here with a Picatinny rail adapter on the back end and a 1913 brace, and I'm not picturing that because these are particularly nice braces to shoot, and that I don't find them personally very comfortable. But the nice thing about it is that these particular braces go across the left side of the gun. So if the person is reaching into the backpack with their right hand to grab the handle of the gun, they can then follow up with their left hand and pull that brace back and get it into action very quickly. Okay. I would not suggest something like the Kel-Tec Sub 2000 at that point. Yes, it's very small and it can be put in a backpack, but the problem is that the Sub 2000 takes a little bit to deploy. Yes, it's small and compact, you pull it out, but then you have to take the thing apart to make sure that it's all adjusted, and if you have a red dot sight on it, there's usually some kind of aperture that you have to switch around for it. It's not a very good gun to use from its folded state. Now, if it's such that you have a place where you can hide it in the meantime, like up in an elevated sound booth, you have all the time that you need to pre-stage it, to go ahead and open it up beforehand and get the red dot fixed and all those kinds of things. But if you're dealing with someone who's going to be down in the sanctuary, because the sound booth is not a viable option, because either A, there isn't really a sound booth, or the sound booth is at the same level as everybody else. If that's the case, you want something that can fit in a backpack that is going to be very quick to deploy. Draw it with one hand, pull the brace back with the other hand, get that third point of contact, get on target as quick as possible. And something like this is going to do that job. And I'm looking specifically at something that's right-handed setup. You pull the gun out with your right hand, you'll pull the brace back with your left. Of course, if you are left-handed, you mirror image that. You pick a brace system that folds over to the right so that your right hand grabs the brace. Okay. But these are basically things that I would suggest that people look at. Okay. Even professionals will wind up missing beyond 15 yards. The only people who are going to be able to do a shot of around 15 yards or more successfully in this kind of situation are people who are very, 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 very highly skilled. Okay, these are not your average citizen These are people who are not even your average professional. These are usually firearms instructors who are able to pull off shots like this. That is not a reasonable thing to expect of your average church response team. And because of that, it's a good idea to have a long gun in the sanctuary. If you have a place where you can pre-stage it, you can have the gun loaded and ready to go, preferably with the safety on. And there's some interesting philosophy on that, but generally speaking, the gun loaded, round in the chamber with the safety on for long guns is usually what winds up working best. And if you have, some kind of a position that regular people in the sanctuary are not going to have access to, or they're not going to easily see what's up there, an AR-15 is a very effective tool. There are reasons why you might not want to use an AR-15, and part of that is lethality. And if you value the life of the potential perpetrator, you still want to be able to stop them. But you also would prefer that they see justice if possible. You might want to step it down a little bit to something like a CZ Scorpion or a Kel-Tec SEP 2000, because they shoot 9mm instead of rifle cartridges. If you're worried about how the media is going to spin this, especially if you're using an AR-15, that's pretty much like media bait right there. You might consider a Mini 14 for the rifle, for a rifle caliber rifle. And if you want something that's not quite as powerful, that is more likely to preserve the life of the perpetrator, the CZ512 is not a terrible option, at least in terms of being relatively low power, has decent reliability, and it is something that is not immediately offensive to media types like the AR-15 would be. And then if you're in a situation where you do not have a position where someone can shoot a long gun from that is removed from the rest of the sanctuary, and particularly elevated from the rest of the sanctuary, you're going to basically have a randomly positioned person with a backpack that has something in it that can be easily deployed, and you do want to make sure that it's something that can be easily deployed. Grab it, pull the brace or the stock back, and that's all they have to do to engage the weapon. Okay. Those are ways to take care of the common problems that we see in church shooting situations. Once the person gets into the sanctuary, the big room with lots of people, that is when things have the potential to go their worst. Okay, that's the environment that they want to be in. That's where they have all the targets they could possibly want, and the distances are going to be spread out enough that they're not going to be overly worried about people with handguns, because most people with handguns are not going to be all that accurate at those kinds of distances. This particular gentleman didn't bank on the fact that there would be a firearms instructor there who would be able to make that shot. If Mr. Wilson wasn't there and it was just an average member of the church, there probably would have been a lot more people that died that day. Okay, but if you had somebody there who had a long gun, who even being relatively low skilled, they could have taken care of the problem as well. When people use long guns in situations like this, the chances of missing goes down considerably. Missing with a handgun at these kinds of distances, your probability of missing for the average user, actually even the average professional, the average law enforcement officer, is 70 to 80% of the time you'll miss with a handgun at these kinds of distances. With an actual rifle, though, even if it's a pistol caliber rifle, your odds of missing go down considerably. Instead of missing 70 to 80% of the time, you're only going to be missing about, maybe at max, 50% of the time. And that might sound substantial, but to put that in more realistic terms, if you're using a typical pistol caliber out of a typical pistol, it will take a law enforcement officer on average about 10 shots to put a suspect down. Whereas with a long gun, because of the increased accuracy, the number of shots is, for even law enforcement officers, is usually down to 3. That's what that actually means in practice. Having a long gun around greatly reduces the chances of bad things happening, and a lot of things are come to decisions beforehand. Stopping threats before they get into the sanctuary is good, and with the least amount of force necessary is always good. But if the situation gets to this point where you have an active shooter in the sanctuary, you do want to be able to take them down quickly, and you cannot bank on somebody being there who can make the long shot, because in the sanctuary there's going to be some long shots. And you can't always count on a highly skilled handgun user being there to take care of it. Introduce the long guns. Having them around is not a bad idea. And like I said, if you're in a church that happens to have an elevated sound booth or something like that, really good idea to consider a full-size gun. For moral reasons, you might want to use something of a little less power. There are good options for that. Something that might be a little bit more incognito as far as carrying in a gun case every Sunday morning and carrying it out every Sunday afternoon might not be the kind of attention that you want. So something that fits in a backpack can be a good option. Also understand that Christians are not very popular at all, and the media will love to spin things regarding Christians and weapons, so you might want to use a weapon that is not quite so offensive to the eyes. So the Ruger Mini 14 for an actual rifle caliber gun is good. CZ512 also has a fairly unassuming appearance, but is a very extremely accurate gun and is powerful enough to get the job done, sufficient at least, might not be optimal, but if you're going to use it, you're doing it with the intent of trying to preserve the other person's life as much as possible, the perpetrator's life as much as possible. But again, it's an unassuming gun, but still long, accurate, can deal with a threat in the sanctuary. And if you don't have a position where you can really stage a weapon in basically an open configuration, it's just right there next to the sound guy where he can grab it, then your other option is to have someone in the church with a backpack with a very fast deploying kind of mini long gun, such as a CZ Scorpion with a Picatinny brace on it. And be specific about the side that brace is on. If they're a right-handed person, you want the brace to fold over onto the left side so that they grab the gun with the right hand, pull the brace back with the left. And of course, if they're left-handed, you do the reverse. They grab the gun with the left hand, they pull the hand brace back from the right, so make sure that it actually folds to the right if you're dealing with a left-handed person. Okay. Those are my suggestions for dealing with church shooters once they get into the sanctuary, because once they get into the sanctuary, handguns are not going to be your best bet. Handguns, you're going to have a very high likelihood of missing a lot of shots, and there's a very high probability that you're going to hit someone who is situationally innocent. In the case of the UPS driver hostage situation, 2 people died that should not have that day. The UPS driver and one of the people in the surrounding vehicles. Okay. In the case of the church shooting in Texas, in which Mr. Wilson intervened, frankly, they got lucky. There are not many people in the world who could make that shot. He was one of the few who could. They simply got lucky that day. You probably won't be, to be brutally honest. Okay? It really is a good idea to consider having a long gun staged somewhere in the sanctuary. And I would encourage you to give good thought to a lot of the options that are out there. Okay, I'm not saying that these guns that I have here are the only options by far, and there are a lot of gun guys out there that will probably be able to give you some very good advice on what some of the other alternatives might be. But this is to at least get you thinking, and thinking in terms of the reality that Christians are not very popular right now. And like I said, the largest group of religious martyrs in the world right now are Christians. And what makes Christians different, especially it tends to be a lot stronger with American Christians, is that we really do believe in our right to self-defense. And I would suggest that you take that right very seriously and make use of it, because it could save your life and the life of your fellow church members. It's a good thing. None of us want this situation to happen where a church shooter comes in. None of us want that. And we really don't want them to make it all the way into the big room with lots of people. But if they do, we need to be practical about how we're going to deal with it. And the practical reality is that when people are using lethal force, destroying innocent lives in front of you, situationally innocent lives in front of you, you need to be able to respond with lethal force if necessary. And you need to be able to deal with it effectively with as little collateral damage as possible. And handguns are not a good option for that. People miss with handguns in real life situations beyond 15 yards. Have a long gun somewhere in there. If you have an elevated sound booth, use that. If not, have a random person in the sanctuary who has a backpack at their feet that has a very quickly deploying mini long gun in it. That would be my suggestions. Okay, I'm not putting this forward as absolute dogma. I'm not saying that you absolutely have to take my advice or anything like that. I'm just saying think about these things, give them due consideration, talk them over with your church leaders, and act accordingly. Okay, none of us wants to see this kind of loss of life. And none of us want it to be us who's responsible for the loss of life. None of us wants to have to shoot someone who's situationally innocent. And frankly, we'd rather not even shoot the shooter if possible. We'd like for it to be dealt with as soon as possible. And like I said, what happened in the church shooting in Texas, that should never have happened. They should have dealt with that person right at the door. All the signs were there. And when someone comes in with an obviously fake beard and you can identify who it is and you know this person is a troublemaker, all the red flags go off. Just deal with it right then and there. Do not let them get into the big room with lots of people. Okay, but we're not always that lucky to have those kinds of warnings, to have all those red flags. And even when they did have all the red flags, they still didn't do what they probably should have done. And bad things happened, and luckily they had someone there with a handgun who could deal with it. But most of the time, people with handguns cannot deal with shots that long. You need to be realistic about that. Okay? So I'm putting this out there for especially pastors and other church leaders who are responsible for the welfare of their congregation to think about these things, to think about them long and hard, and to make the tough decisions. Like I said, I'm not putting forward anything as being absolutely adamant, and even with people that I've been harsh with, there is still the reality of the situation that you don't know how you're going to deal with a stressful situation until you're in it, especially a life and death situation. And so, yeah, there was the woman who was kind of standing in the middle of the gunfight, and she was not helping anything at all, and I call that out. But at the same time, it's not like I'm going to suggest that there should be any kind of prosecution against her or anything like that. Normal person reacting to a terrible situation. And there are lots of things that went wrong. I'm sure these people have had a lot of time to think about it and have thought about it multiple times, and probably a lot of things that they would do differently now. So I don't want to be overly hard on them. But let's learn the lessons, and let's take this seriously. Christians are in a disadvantaged place right now. We wear targets on our backs. Both foreign and domestic, Christians are under attack. And what I want to see is Christians take their own self-defense seriously. It is a God-given right, and here in America, at least for the time being, it is also a legal right. This suggests that we avail ourselves of it. Now, we're still going to act like Christians when we do it. We're still going to seek to preserve as much life as possible, meaning that we're going to understand the limitations of handguns in wide open spaces, that they're really not the best tool there, and there's a good chance that you could wind up missing and hitting someone that you don't want to. And so having a long gun in that big wide open space is a really good idea. And we're also going to give at least some consideration to the perpetrator. We would prefer that the perpetrator be brought to justice, that they would stand trial as much as possible. It's not always practical, but we're at least going to give consideration to that possibility. All right, thank you all very much for your time and attention. Bye-bye.